Ephesians chapter 5 is where we are at. Imitations are something that are not seen in a favorable light in our society. We don't necessarily like imitations. If you are saving up money to buy the latest Nikes with the latest colorway or whatever, and you're like, man, I got to get those. I got to get my hands on those. You don't want, you're not looking for a dupe. You're not looking for an imitation, man. You want to spend the money. You want to get the real thing, and you want to be able to tell everybody, because you want to be able to flex on everybody. Like, no, these are the real thing. No, I didn't buy these from the Philippines or China or whatever. Like, no, these are the real thing, and I spent this much money on them. So we don't necessarily like imitations. There are lots of bands out, musicians that are imitations of the real thing. People who imitate the real thing, the real band, the real musician, the real entertainer, and make their living that way. And though we might like the music and they might do an excellent job of doing it, still it's always in the back of our mind thinking, but it's not really the real thing, and I only paid $5 to watch them, and so it just doesn't feel the same. However, God, in Ephesians chapter 5, speaking through Paul, actually tells us that he likes imitations. And we're going to be in chapter 5, obviously, tonight in the first 7 verses. Let me show you how I've broken down the chapter. We'll only look at the first 7 verses. But if you're one of the note takers in here, you'll see there we have walk in love tonight, verses 1 through 7. Next time, walk in light, verses 8 to 14. Walk in wisdom, verses 15 through 21. And then at the end, walk in order in verses 22 to 33. Again, tonight we'll be looking at walking in love. Why walking in love, and what does that have to do with being an imitation? Well, verse 1 opens up this chapter, this section, by saying this. Therefore, that would mean whatever we've learned from the past, from the book of Ephesians, now keeping that in mind, be imitators. There it is. We're to be imitators of God. And then he tells us, as dear children. Now, this does not mean that we are to be little gods. Some Bible teachers actually teach that you too, you've got God in you, so that means that you can be a little God. That's not what Paul is saying. And we cannot be little gods. When he says to be an imitation of God, it doesn't mean that we're to try to make ourselves or bring ourselves up to that level of, hey, I am a God or I am God. What he means is that we should do the same things that God does and did and has done and will do. And that we should, in fact, we're going to see it, that he's going to use Jesus as an example. It's very easy for us to go back to the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and go, okay, well, how did Jesus live? And then to do our best to imitate that. And that really is one of the goals of the Christian life, is to be more like God, to be more like his son Jesus. And so thankfully we have that example, the examples there in the Gospels. But that's what he's telling us tonight, and that's what he told the Ephesians so long ago. Therefore, be imitators of God as dear children. Now, again, we're talking this week about walking in love. And so the idea is that we would imitate God by walking in love. Now, he's going to tell us how to do that. Notice verse 2. Verse 2 says, and walk in love. So, very easy to see. Walk in love. That's the title of this section. But then he tells us how. Because, of course, we want to know, well, what does that look like? If I'm supposed to imitate God, do the things that God did, live the way that Jesus lived, what exactly does that look like? Well, I'm glad that you asked, because he tells us. We are to walk in love, and he tells us as Christ. So I'm going to go ahead and put that up here as one of my notes, I think. Is it coming up? Yes, there it is. As Christ, verse 2. I am to walk in love as Christ. So Paul uses the ultimate example of love. Jesus Christ. Now, Christ was his title. It wasn't his last name. It wasn't his middle name. It's Jesus the Messiah. Christ is the same word as Messiah. So walk in love as Christ. Now, some of you will know this already, But the word love there in verse 2 is the word agape. There were different words in the original Greek language for love. Phileo, that sounds like Philadelphia. Philadelphia is called the city of brotherly love. Phileo means brotherly love. There were different types of love. There was eros, E-R-O-S, and that was an erotic love. Different words. Now, in the American language, we have one word, that's love. And so we love the Lord. But tonight, some of you will go to Cane's because you love Cane's. Or you love In-N-Out. Or you love whatever your favorite fast food restaurant is. And we have just one word and we use it for everything. Now, we would all agree, well, no, I love the Lord or I love my mom different than I love chicken, hopefully. And hopefully you love your mom more. Okay? Different types of love. We just say love and we understand what we're talking about. But it is getting harder and harder to understand what the word love means because there are new definitions for it popping up all of the time. A common phrase right now is love is love. And we're going to hear a lot of that over the next month, the month of June. You're going to hear a lot of it. Love is love. What does that mean? And it sounds great that love is love. You know, love is just love. And it sounds like, oh, yeah, that sounds so cool or mystical or whatever you might think. But I want to know, before I agree with that, what kind of love are you talking about? What are we talking about here? What kind of love is it? Now, what we're going to hear about when we hear that phrase, love is love, generally speaking means homosexual love is real love, is what they're saying. And that could take lots of different forms. But is that what Paul is talking about here in verse 2 when he says, and walk in love? This is not a Philadelphia love. It's not an eros love. This is an agape love. Many of you are familiar with that. And what does agape love mean? Well, he actually tells us here in verse 2. And walk in love as Christ. So we know that we're supposed to walk in love as Christ, the way that Christ loved. And he had an agape love. Well, what does that mean? As Christ also has loved us. We'll stop there for just a minute. How did Christ love us? How did Jesus love us? Well, we know from studying that the first way that he loved us was, or still is, I'm sorry, guess I didn't put that up there. Let me just tell you what it is. Unconditional. He loved us unconditionally, if you're taking notes. He loved us unconditionally, meaning Jesus loved and still loves you unconditionally. You did not have to meet any conditions in order for Jesus to love you. You did not have to attain to some religious level of perfection in order for Jesus to love you. You did not have to travel to some holy site somewhere in the world in order for Jesus to love you. Jesus already loved you and still loves you the way that you are. That's unconditional love. That's agape love. So he tells us, walk in love as Christ has also loved us. He loved us unconditionally. The second thing that describes his love is that it was self-sacrificial love. So he loved us unconditionally and then self-sacrificially. Again, it says in verse 2, and walk in love as Christ also has loved us. And then here's the other part of his love. And given himself for us. You know, love is, you could tell anybody that you love them. It actually is real easy. Again, we can say, oh man, I really love Cane's, or I really love Chick-fil-A, or I really love whatever your favorite restaurant is. Again, we could say that. It's easy to say love. What do we mean by that? And then showing it is an entirely different thing. You can say that you love your mom or that you love your dad, but living in obedience to them is going to show them that. And I think it's good to tell your family members that you love them and tell them often. I try to do that with my family, to tell them often, remind them of that. But I also want to show them. when I show them, I'm showing them how much I love them. And if I've got parents and I'm living under their authority, under their leadership, then my obedience to them is showing them how much I love them. If I do the dishes because I'm asked to do the dishes, but I do it grudgingly or with a bad attitude or complaining, then what I'm saying to them is I love you, I just don't love you that much. I love myself more. And doing this is kind of cramping my style. And I really, really like my style. So loving somebody and showing them, sacrificing on their behalf, is showing them that agape love. And that's the example that Jesus gave us. So Christ has also loved us. So he loved us unconditionally, but also self-sacrificially. It says that he has given himself for us. Now this is important, the second part of verse 2. Still speaking about his sacrifice, it says that Jesus gave himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. Now that sweet-smelling aroma, some of you will automatically know what we're talking about because you've been with me on Sunday mornings going through the Old Testament books, and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, and we know what the sweet-smelling aroma is. In the Old Testament, if you're not familiar, there was a sacrificial system. It was part of the worship of God. There were other things, actually, not just animals. There were other things that were sacrificed also. But one of the major things was animals. And when they would sacrifice the animals, the idea was that the smell of that meat cooking, which, by the way, most of us like. Some of us are vegetable-arians. But a lot of us like that smell of meat, man. You smell a hamburger cooking, or you smell a bacon wrapped hot dog cooking after you come out of an LA Galaxy game. Oh, especially if they win, and then you come out and you buy a hot dog, bacon wrapped hot dog with all the vegetables and onions and everything on it, and it just tastes that much sweeter. But the smell of it, and they all, outside of LA Galaxy Stadium, right, just as you come out of the gates, they're all kind of just circled up right there. And so you come out and you just, boom, it just hits you in the face. You're just like, oh, I need one of those to complete my life. But the smell of meat oftentimes, mom cooking steak or whatever, that's a sweet smell. That's the idea here, is that he's referring back to Old Testament sacrifices. Those things were pleasing to God, sweet smelling. And Jesus sacrificed himself. He was the Lamb of God who sacrificed himself. And he was a sweet smelling aroma to the Lord. But I told you that was important. Here's why it's important. It's important to understand why Jesus sacrificed himself. Did he sacrifice himself because we were just so lovely and just so cute and he just had to sacrifice himself for us? No, it actually was ultimately in obedience. Yes, he did give himself for us or on our behalf, but the reason he did that was in obedience to the Father and because it was pleasing to the Father. Jesus lived in obedience to God the Father. It wasn't because of us being special. It was out of love for his Father and out of obedience to his Father. And God wanted to rescue us, and Jesus was willing to go and be that sacrifice in order for the Father to rescue us. So we need to understand that. Walk in love. Now, he uses the highest example. It's like, really, Paul, you just had to go to Jesus to give us the perfect example of love. But we always want to make sure that we're reaching, that we're growing, that we're doing our best to attain, to get to this place where, you know what, I'm reaching for the love of Christ. I want the love of Christ. I want to live that out. I want to live out the agape love with people. And you know what? I'm not there yet. But that's what I'm reaching for. That's what I'm pursuing. And so we want to make sure that that's the kind of love that we're pursuing. Again, this coming month, what is June 1st? That's Saturday or Sunday, right? I mean, it's coming up real quick. We're going to be here. We're going to begin to hear about love, and you're going to see it all over the place. You're going to see it in the stores that you go to do your shopping. You're going to see it at just all over the place on the shows that you watch and videos on YouTube and TikTok and everywhere else. You're going to see it all over the place. You're going to see love is love. And there are going to be all kinds of examples that the world is going to put forth as an example of love. But you and I, we know the difference. We know what real love is. Real love is unconditional and it's self-sacrificial. It's not grabbing and taking more. It's giving. Love gives. So you need to keep that in mind. As you, all of you beautiful young people, as you get older and eventually you start to date, you need to remember that. That love doesn't take and grab and want more. Love is always looking to give, to sacrifice, to give more, to put somebody else first. Keep that in mind. Now, when I am walking, again, we've got this theme of walking in love, walking in light, walking in wisdom, walking in order. So we've got this theme of walking. Walking can sometimes be dangerous. I like to stay aware of my surroundings at all times. And so I'm always watching and looking around. And earlier today, I was out on one of my weekly walks, or I try to make it a daily walk, get a little bit of exercise in these old bones. But where my daughter and I were out, and we had the dogs, and I don't even like the dogs, but we're walking the dogs. My daughter's always like, sure, I'll go for a walk, and then she comes out with both dogs, and it's like, oh, great, okay, give me the bigger one, you know. But we're out on a walk, and I'm always paying attention, looking around, and just trying to avoid things, you know, and looking for dogs and whatever else. And I almost fell today for the first time in like forever. I was walking, and there was just a piece of the cement, I don't know, was sticking up a little bit higher, or my right leg was lazy. I don't know what happened. But I started to trip, and I didn't trip, and I didn't fall. But still, it's when you're walking, sometimes it can be dangerous. Some of you, I'm not looking at anybody in specific, but some of you are clumsy. And I don't have to point you out. You already know it. You'd be like, yeah, I'm clumsy. And you can be walking, and you're just paying attention. You can walk right into a pole. Or you could walk right into somebody else, or walk off the curb and fall down or something. Some of you are just clumsy that way, and you know it. But it is important that when we're walking, that we're watching where we're going, right? Nowadays with our phones, man, it's easy to bump into somebody, especially if you're at school, and you're going through a crowded hallway, and there's so many people that are just on their phone. Now, we get pretty good at it and we can navigate, but there are some people who cannot walk and be on their phone at the same time, right? You might have a friend like that, and you're just like, hey, put your phone away, please. Just wait till we stop, then get on your phone. But it can be dangerous. What we want to do is when we walk in love, we want to walk as Christ walked. And then here's the uncomfortable part in the remaining verses 3 through 7. It's when we walk, we want to avoid pitfalls. And in here specifically, it's avoid sexual pitfalls. Now, we've already gone through a list before, and some of you might be thinking, man, why is Paul just so caught up in talking about these sexual sins and these sexual pitfalls, and why is he warning the church so much? You need to understand that the times that they were living in, that ancient Greek world, that ancient Roman world, that it was highly sensual. The Greek mind, the Greek people were consumed with sexuality. If you were here for the beginning of Ephesians, you remember me talking about the temple of Diana being in Ephesus, and she was this multi-breasted statue, and fertility, and it was just all this weird idolatry. But it was all revolving around sexuality, sensuality. And the Greeks were all about it. Now, that's not too far removed from where you and I live. I mean, we're in the United States, yes, but we're in California. And I mean, it's everywhere, right? It's everywhere. You drive down the freeway and there's billboards and all of that kind of stuff. But a lot of us are on social media. And many of you know, I mean, it's literally clicks away. It doesn't take but 1 or 2 clicks, and all of a sudden, like, man, I did not ask for that video, or I did not ask for that picture. And it's just everywhere. But you see it in music videos, sexuality, always being pushed at us. Always being pushed at us. It's very similar to what they were living in. So these Ephesians were living in that type of environment, that type of mindset. And then they hear the gospel and they get saved. And now they're saved out of that mess. But as you can imagine, just like it is here, it still touched the church. It still has an effect on the church. And there are people in church who still struggle with that sexuality. And so it was a huge deal. And that's why Paul's talking about it again and warning them again. Now, he begins in verse 3, telling them how to avoid sexual pitfalls. He tells them in verse 3, but, okay, now he's already given us the example. You got to walk in love as Christ. That means that you need to walk with this unconditional love and a self-sacrificial love. He said, but as you're walking, you've got to avoid these pitfalls, and these are sexual in nature. And we see it right off the bat in verse 3, but fornication. Now, fornication, the original word is the word porneia, Porneia, porneia. Obviously, we've heard that before. Porneia is not a common word to us, but porn sure is. That's the word there, fornication. And that is speaking about sex before marriage, fornication. He says, but fornication, and then he goes on to say all uncleanness. When he says all uncleanness, that's a general way to say sexual immorality, just any kind of sexual immorality. So fornication and all uncleanness, or covetousness. What is covetousness? It is a greedy desire to have more. And you go, well, I don't understand. Why would he put coveting in here? Because it's all sexual in nature. And the idea is that the society that they were living in was consumed with sexuality, and it was never enough. Never enough. And those are the times that we're living in. It's never enough. And I told you a few weeks ago that there are right now people in government pushing to pass laws to allow the same type of environment here in our world. And you're going to have to deal with it because my generation won't step up and do something about it to stop it. We just don't care enough because, well, it's bad, but it's not that bad yet. And so that's just how things operate, man. We just let things go until it's too late. And now here it is. And once it goes, there's no going back. And so we're headed to the same place. Covetousness is the idea here, when it's included in this list, is the idea that it's just that sexuality is never enough. It's never going to be enough. It's not going to be enough until everybody accepts it. But fornication, all uncleanness, covetousness, look what he says. Let it not even be named among you as is fitting for saints. You and I are saints. That does not mean that we're perfect. Saints means that we're set apart for God's use. And he's warning the church, he's telling the Ephesians, listen, these sexual pitfalls, they should not even be named among you. They should not be anywhere in your church. We should talk about them only to warn, but they should not be problems that we're dealing with. And yet we find ourselves dealing with these problems. It was a warning for them. It's still a warning for us. Let it not even be named among you, but I love the word fitting. It's not fitting as saints. It's prom season, it's graduation season, it's suit season, it's dress season. And, you go and get a suit. It's always fun watching people, wear suits, and sometimes they're too big or they're too small, or, all the different things, or dresses, and does it fit right? Some of you young ladies, you went to prom or whatever, or graduation, whatever, and you got a dress, and does it fit right, and does it look right? And, the idea here is that you put these things on a Christian, and it's not fitting. That doesn't look right. The fornication, the uncleanness, the covetousness, you put those on a Christian, it's not fitting. That's not a good fit. So they need to be removed. You need to avoid those things. Verse 4, he goes on, he continues, saying neither filthiness, that's the word obscenity. It means obscene, obscenity. Filthiness, nor foolish talking. Now you'll notice in verse 3 and then verse 4, he transitioned from living that sexuality to language and sexuality. Verse 4. Filthiness, he's talking about speaking and being obscene. The phrase foolish talking there is the word morologia, and it's where we get our word moronic from. Moron, you've heard that before, you moron. It's not a word that we use too often anymore, but moronic. He's saying that this kind of talk, this kind of sexual talk, is moronic. It's obscene, it's moronic. And then he says, no coarse jesting. Now, in the original language, it just says jesting or joking. But because it's included with this language, what he's talking about is coarse jesting, coarse joking. Now, there's nothing wrong with joking. Unless you do too much. I tend to do it too much. I had to, one of the things that when I came from Calvary San Bernardino over to here, that was one of the things that I really tried to cut back on because I used to joke around, mess around so much. And some of you might be thinking, man, Pastor Chris, you mess around a lot here. I know, but you probably pat me on the back if you knew how much I used to mess around. I can just mess around and say stupid things and laugh and whatever else. But this is talking about a different kind of joking, a different kind of jesting, a different kind of messing around. There's nothing wrong with messing around, having fun, joking around with friends. But the translators, when they added coarse jesting, it was to give us a clearer idea, although we don't necessarily need it because we understand that these are all sexual in nature. But the coarse jesting is vulgar joking. It's dirty jokes. It's somebody, joking and laughing and, giving innuendos and, this thing or whatever and, talking about sexuality, but joking about it. He says, neither filthiness. Now keep in mind, he said, let it not even be named among you. It's not fitting for saints. And he says, by the way, this should not be named among you either. Filthiness, obscenity, foolish talking, moronic talking, or coarse jesting. It's just not fitting. Which are, verse 4, he tells us again, which are not fitting. But what should I use my mouth for? Giving of thanks. Giving of thanks. Now, do you have a problem with friends or maybe even family members who they always seem to want to tell you dirty jokes? And it might even be because, he's a Christian or she's a Christian. Let's tell them a dirty joke to try and, they try to get under your skin. They try to, bug you with that. One of the ways to shut them down is that when they start to do that, use your mouth instead to start thanking God. You know what? I'm just so thankful to God for, and then just you start naming your blessings. Name them one by one. Count your many blessings and see what God has done. But you start thanking God, using your mouth to thank God. They won't want to stick around. Or maybe they'll be convicted and want to hear more about your God. But we ought to be using our mouths instead of coarse jesting. We ought to be using it to thank God. In Mark chapter 7, Jesus said this, for from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. 13 things he rattled off. All these evil things come from within and defile a man. He said again in Matthew chapter 12, but I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. So our language, the things that we talk about, even those are important to the Lord. He goes on in verse 5 to say, for this you know. It's like, why should we not do that? For this you know, that no fornicator, unclean person. Now just, you heard the list before. We talked about fornication, uncleanness, covetousness. Now look what he says. For this you know that no fornicator, unclean person, nor covetous man, who is an idolater. What does he mean by that? He means somebody that has made sex an idol. Like, that's what they spend their time, talent, and treasure on. Their mind is always in the gutter. It's actually, sexuality is actually an idol to them. They worship it. He says, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. In other words, you can't take those things with you into the kingdom of God. It's not fitting. God condemns it. It's not okay. So, if those individuals that live that way are not a part of the kingdom of God, then why would we as saints want to imitate them? We don't want to imitate them. We want to imitate God. We want to imitate Christ, right? So these things should not even be named. He goes on in verse 6 to say, let no one deceive you with empty words. That means they're fruitless. It's like, putting cotton candy in your mouth, and, oh, that's really good. Wait, where did it go? It just dissolves. There's nothing there. Let no one deceive you with empty words. For because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. You see, what the world is telling you is that, sexuality is a good thing. And it doesn't matter if you're married or not, and you know what, just as long, and it doesn't even matter who you want to be sexual with, just, whoever it is love. Now, you've got a decision to make. The world is going to continue to tell you that. What are you going to believe? Are you going to believe what they tell you, what the commercials say, what the videos say, what your favorite musician says? Or are you going to believe what God's word says? Because according to God's word, love is not love. Their words are empty. They're fruitless. And because of that, the wrath of God comes upon them. And you might go, well, they're just enjoying this, carefree life and living how they want. Yeah, I get it. Seems like that sometimes. Like they just live that way, and they just don't seem to have any problems. And it seems like they're just glamorizing that lifestyle and living it up. Yeah, I get it. But God is keeping account, and His wrath will come upon them. So we don't want to use them as our example. Their words are fruitless. Don't be deceived by them. Finally, in verse 7, where you and I end, is, therefore, do not be partakers with them. Do not have any fellowship with them. Don't partner up with them. Preach to them. Share the gospel. Share the love of God with them. But don't make them your best friend, those individuals that have that filthy mind, filthy mouth, filthy life, filthy language. That's not someone that I should be keeping company with on a regular basis. Did Jesus have that kind of interaction with those kinds of people? He did, briefly. But again, He was Jesus, right? He did. But then He would always return to His disciples and to time alone with God the Father. It wasn't like He went there and He hung out with, tax collectors and sinners and publicans and prostitutes. Okay, He did have interaction with them, but there was time with them, but then He would always return back to His disciples and to the will of God and what God was having Him do. So we want to be the same way. If and when we have interaction with them, and they need to hear the gospel from someone, but we want to make sure that we're not being partners with them, partakers with them. We want to make sure that we are saints separated to God. Father, thank you so much for this time.